Thanks for being here. The Iraq War was intensely frustrating, continues to be frustrating. I'm sure you feel the same way. The way I usually describe it is it's like Catch-22, except for you don't get the ultimate justification that you beat the Nazis. Instead, you didn't do anything. However, there are lessons to be learned. And if we're able to learn lessons from the torture fiasco and actually have some institutional learning that endures for some period of time, then maybe we will have somewhat of a silver lining. Thanks for everyone who's contributing to that project. So, in 2005, I sent a letter to Senator McCain and approached Senator McCain about some concerns I had regarding detainee abuse in the U.S. military. That eventually contributed to the effort that led to the McCain Amendment, which clarified detainee policy and made it closer to being in accord with U.S. values and human rights. In that letter I wrote, "My approach for clarification provides clear evidence that confusion over standards was a major contributor to prisoner abuse. We owe our soldiers better than this. Give them a clear standard that is in accordance with the bedrock principles of our nation." And there are actually two components of that argument. One of which is that we need clear standards, whatever those standards are, and those need to be communicated down the chain of command. That is more of an instrumental argument. I'll get to that in a minute. Whether or not those standards ought to be in accord with U.S. principles and human rights is a separate argument. And the way these can come apart, I'll give an example, is that I had an argument that I'll refer to again later with a major who was leading Special Forces training, and we were both in agreement that we needed clear standards and a lack of clarity was causing problems. I was adamant that they ought to be in accord with the strict interpretations of the Geneva Conventions and what I consider to be U.S. values. The major disagreed on that point. So these things can come apart. I'm not going to focus on the values. I'm going to focus on the pernicious effect of having unclear standards. Specifically, I'm going to relate that to its contribution to a lack of unity of effort. We've got talk of subcultures. We've got talk of 1st Armored Division doing a good job and other units doing a poor job. That's what I'm speaking to. And ultimately what I'm going to argue is we can think of strategic means and strategic ends. And you set the end out there, the goal. I think most of us here are talking about ends. To some degree they're means, but they're more farther down the ends end of the spectrum. But what I'm going to talk about is actually linking those things together. And I'm going to call it strategic coherence. And my point is that you can have a destination. You can have ultimately some kind of equilibrium outcome as your destination, and you can have equilibrium path to the outcome. So you could imagine that you wanted to terrorize the population, put down an insurgency. That's one outcome. You could imagine that you wanted to win hearts and minds in order to win a counterinsurgency. That's a different outcome. And you have different equilibrium path. Now in that equilibrium path, you're going to have different means that you're going to have to synchronize in order to achieve synergy and achieve your outcome. And if you choose means that are ill-suited to be coherent with each other, then you're actually not going to get anywhere. And I call that strategic incoherence. Basically, strategic incoherence in the U.S. military with respect to interrogations rendered the U.S. military literally incapable of achieving any strategic ends, whatever they might have been. Because it was so incoherent that you couldn't accomplish your goal. So the way to think about this is if you have a ship that has a sail on it and you also have oars, and you're using the oars to go against the wind, you're not going to either of 2 or more ports. You're just stuck there. And that's what I mean by strategic incoherence. All right. So as I was going through my approach for clarification, I think it's important to step back and think, okay, what happened around 9/11? What did training and doctrine look like prior to 9/11 and after 9/11? And Professor Solis was my instructor at West Point. Had a great education at West Point. It was really clear to me what the standards were, as I think it was clear to most West Point graduates at a minimum, if not most U.S. soldiers, about what was expected in terms of detainee treatment. And it was very strict. You treat them absolutely humanely. Think first Gulf War, how we treated Iraqis when they surrendered. Here's your food, here's your tent, we're not going to bother you. Moving on. There were a series of public statements and events that happened after 9/11 that cast some doubt on whether or not that was still the standard. There was some confusion because The President and the Secretary of Defense said that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply to those who were captured in Afghanistan. And then there were a series of memos and decisions that basically undermined the standard that the U.S. had implemented prior to 9/11. And the problem was that in lieu of that clear movement away from the old standard, there was not a new standard erected that was clear and communicated to subordinates what actually was expected as a standard. So in lieu of any of the old standard, there was no standard. And units were free to interpret as they wanted what they ought to do. As you can see in the back and forth, the emails that Doug mentioned earlier. There's, what should we do? Well, here we go. This is what we're going to do. Even though the field manual that predated 9/11 said that those techniques were clearly prohibited. So in lieu of the old standard, we now have no standard. What are we going to do? One of the issues that has come up for me since my approach for clarification and the stand I took is people have questioned how widespread torture was in the U.S. and whether or not I did overstate the problem, both in terms of its scope and in terms of linking it to the chain of command. And what I want to do very briefly is mention some anecdotes from my approach for clarification that I think really highlight the depth of the confusion, the sincerity of some folks to try to do the right thing and still end up doing the wrong thing, and the myriad interpretations of what the right thing was. So, when I started to have concerns about whether or not we were in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, I went to my battalion commander and I said, I think we're in violation of the Geneva Conventions. SecDef just said that we are in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Something's wrong. We need to clarify what we've been doing up to this point in the war. This is about 2004. And my battalion commander responded that he wasn't sure whether or not that was the case, but I should go talk to the JAG lawyer who advised him. Now, right now, you've got a battalion commander already who's pretty high-ranking middle field grade officer who doesn't know what the standard is. And he's directing me to JAG to get clarification. Then I go to my JAG lawyer, and for an hour and a half, I explain the standards I learned at West Point, why what I had seen didn't adhere to those standards, and why there appeared to be some kind of inconsistency between our current policy and our old policy. And I asked him just simply, what is the current U.S. interpretation of the Geneva Conventions? And he provided such incoherent subjective guidance that I couldn't use it. I literally couldn't use it, and I, reasonably intelligent, well-trained former West Pointer, wondered how I could expect my subordinates, who did not benefit from quite so much training and expertise, could possibly use that guidance. And just one example from that conversation, which was about an hour and a half, was that a battalion had created a chair that forced detainees into stress positions, and then they would basically strap them into the chair. And they reached out to the JAG lawyer and said, is this in accordance with the Geneva Conventions? So the lawyer went to that base, sat in the chair, deemed that it did, and gave the okay to the unit. Now, first of all, that's not in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Second of all, that is such a subjective criteria, set of criteria, that you can't hand that to a soldier and say, this is what we expect of you. Another incident, after my approach for clarification became public, I had an E7 Special Forces training taken off to the side in a paternalistic manner, and basically tell me, I understand what you're doing, it's well-intentioned, but you just don't understand what war is really like. I keep in mind I already had 2 combat tours, so this was a little bit like, what are you talking about? But set that aside, he said, this is the important part. He said, we have to do this to win. The only thing they did wrong at Abu Ghraib is they took pictures. And very importantly, folks like Rumsfeld want us to do this, they just don't want it to be public. Now, it doesn't matter whether Rumsfeld actually wanted them to do that or not. The fact is, that NCO in a Special Forces unit, who's basically a senior leader in an elite unit in the U.S. military, not somebody who's running around doing their own thing, sincerely believed that he was following the commander's intent when he did this type of abuse. Fast forward, 4 minutes? Okay. Fast forward, I'll go through this a little faster than I anticipated. Fast forward to Infantry Captain's Career Course, which is centralized training in the U.S. Army. 15 Special Forces officers, well, we were selected, we hadn't finished the Q course yet, but we were going through the training, had a small group instructor, showed us the battle for Algiers, explained why we needed to torture, use interrogational torture to defeat insurgency, And it was very clear that he expected us to do that on the battlefield. This is centralized U.S. Army training. Now, I'm not going to go through other examples. I think that's sufficient. The main problem here is that we have unclear guidance. We have a command climate that encourages this type of behavior. People are free to interpret what they're going to do. And they behave in different ways that are strategically incoherent. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the U.S. military since a 1999, I think, article by General Krulak about something called a strategic corporal. The idea is, I'll read this very quickly, current asymmetric missions that are ambiguous. These missions will require tactical leaders to confidently make well-reasoned and independent decisions under extreme stress. In many cases, the tactical leader, the corporal, will be the most conspicuous symbol of American foreign policy and potentially influence not only immediate tactical situations, but the operational and strategic level as well. The bottom line is that the distinction between tactical, operational, and strategic becomes blurred, and all your decisions have strategic import, or at least many of your decisions have strategic import. Now, this series of articles and responses has a certain flavor. It's mostly about empowering the subordinate, and that empowering of the subordinate takes specifically the form of not micromanaging the subordinate. Let the subordinate do what they need to do. Notably, it does not take the tone of how do we issue effective guidance at the strategic and operational level so that we synchronize these so-called strategic corporals' actions so that they are strategically coherent and achieve the strategic ends we want to achieve. Now, the net effect of this, besides being morally reprehensible, is also that we just have incompetent strategic leadership. Strategic leaders, instead of looking at the strategic corporal as a challenge that they face and treating it as like, how are we going to synchronize all these people together? This is harder than it used to be, but we need to do it. What are some innovative ways to do it? They look at it as an excuse. Oh, there's a few bad apples that went off the rails. That wasn't a strategic problem. That's a tactical problem that had strategic implications. Me as the strategic leader, that's not my fault. That's the tactical person's leader. It's just that now we're in the situation we have strategic corporals. So what should be viewed as a challenge that needs to be addressed, and ultimately should be the responsibility of the strategic leader, has just been punted down to somebody who, quite frankly, is completely ill-equipped to handle that type of burden.